So we're going to go through a Tucker Carlson video. Now, to give you an idea of where I stand, I like Tucker Carlson. I agree with him on most things. I think he's probably the best Fox News host at the moment. I mean, I don't watch Fox much. I don't have actual TV, so I don't watch Tucker show much. I just watch YouTube clips. But I think he's a good dude. I think he's a guy that is really, for the most part, just honest. He's not a partisan hack or anything. He seems like a good dude. But when I see him saying things that I think are massively incorrect, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to call him out on it. I'm not going to say he has to be a purist. I'm just saying he has to be not wrong. And on this issue, it's not that I disagree with him in terms of opinion. It's that he's talking economics, and in this sense, he is wrong. So it's only going to be about 4 minutes of a clip here. So hopefully we can keep this short, but I'm just going to go through bit by bit. Up to 4 minutes, 12 seconds. Of course, the video is in the description, the full video that I'm referencing here, if you want to watch that as well.
Republicans in Congress can't promise to protect American industries. They wouldn't dare to do that. It might violate some principle of Austrian economics. It might make the Koch brothers mad. It might alienate the libertarian ideologues who, to this day, fund most Republican campaigns.
So this was all over my Facebook feed because it came out once again against Austrian economics, and I take issue with what he says here. I think he's interpreted this thing completely wrong. For one, he says libertarian ideologues, they fund most campaigns, and that, well, I mean, you have to imagine that who did the Koch brothers fund in the 2016 election? Scott Walker. He was the first guy out. So they have influence. They don't have that much influence. But overall, into the people that say oh, everything, all this pro-capitalist stuff are just Koch brothers shilling, and that, no, it's not. But Tucker Carlson seems to think that the Republican Party or the mainstream GOP is in any way libertarian, or at least libertarian on economics, or supportive of Austrian economics, and that's just flat out false. Ask how many go around and ask all all the politicians, what do they think of that Austrian economics? Do they agree with Austrian economics? And most of them will either, the vast majority of them, besides 4, will either say no, or I don't even know what that is. So that's what I have an issue with it. For him just saying it's oh yeah, the mainstream conservatism is or the establishment conservatives been using Austrian economics and libertarian policy. It's that. Why do you think there's a libertarian party? Because no, it's not at all. It's quite the opposite.
No, a Republican did not say that, sadly. Instead, the words you just heard are from, and brace yourself here, Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts. It's true. Yesterday, Warren released what she called her plan for economic patriotism. Amazingly, that's pretty much what it is, economic patriotism. There's not a word about identity politics in the document. There are no hysterics about gun control or climate change. There's no lecture about the plight of transgender illegal immigrants. It's just pure old-fashioned economics.
So I guess I should add, now that I think about this, I should add for those that are going to point out that that's not actually what he said. He's just quoting Elizabeth Warren. Yeah, but then he immediately did add up with, unfortunately, sadly, Republicans didn't say this. So obviously he does agree with that. But yeah, so he agrees with Warren on this. He agrees with old-fashioned economics, which, I mean, it depends what you mean by old-fashioned economics, because you could say economics have gone wrong, but to say that they've gone wrong because they've gone in the Austrian direction is no. I refuse to believe that at all. They've gone in the opposite direction, away from the the Austrian and Chicago schools. But no, you'll see here Tucker Carlson pretty much agrees with when it comes to economic policy, he's pretty much on the same page as Elizabeth Warren, or in not necessarily a Bernie Sanders or AOC, but more in the progressive direction. You could say he's kind of a progressive on economics, and that is what a lot of establishment conservatives are today. The capitalism is good, but unfortunately it's majorly flawed, and we have to have all of these big government programs and regulations to stop capitalism from being awful. And I can see why someone would think that, but for the most part, I don't think that's true. It seems that most of these so-called solutions to capitalism are, in fact, the reason people dislike capitalism in the first place, because they enact a policy that says, oh, we're gonna fix capitalism from causing depressions and that, and then the policies they put in place are the ones that actually end up causing the depression. So it's look back to the Great Depression. What caused the Great Depression in the first place? Government intervention, Fed manipulating with interest rates and doing things they didn't understand. And then what made the Depression great? The New Deal, government intervention, trying to fix the economy. And the easiest way to look at that, just to give a quick, 2-second argument, is why doesn't anyone talk about the Great Depression of 1920? Started out just as bad, pretty catastrophic, high unemployment rate. The government did absolutely nothing. In fact, it did what the opposite of the Keynesians believe. And instead of spending more, they cut spending. And there's a reason we don't talk about it, because it lasted about a year. It just kind of literally fixed itself. Yeah, so in this sense, Tucker Carlson does pretty much disagree with the perspectives of Milton Friedman or Thomas Sowell. I imagine they would say, yes, Tucker Carlson is wrong on this. He aligns more with the progressives. And that's fine. You can have a different opinion on economics, or you can have a different opinion on politics. I'm not saying you have to be right-wing on everything, but what I am saying is the progressives are wrong. So therefore, he is wrong on this.
How to preserve good-paying American jobs. Even more remarkable, many of Warren's policy prescriptions make obvious sense. She says the U.S. government should buy American products when it can.
So that's not necessarily something I think very many people disagree with. The U.S. government, when it's going to buy things, should buy them from Americans. Okay, I have no issue with that. I don't even think the Austrians have much of an issue with that, because it doesn't really talk about what governments should buy. It's just talking about free market capitalism in general. Though I did hear him use the word obvious there, which is is something that I don't like to hear when it comes to economics. When someone says the answer is obvious, it should be obvious, that's a red flag, honestly, when you're talking about anything that isn't obvious. Because if something is obvious, what that means is you really haven't put much thought into it. What it means is that if something is obvious, then, again, why would you spend all this time researching and quadruple checking to make sure you're right if the answer is obvious? It's just a waste of time to constantly do a ton of research into something that has an obvious answer. And economics is not obvious. We find that things are surprisingly complicated, that the common sense expectation, what you would think would be the obvious answer, turns out to be the exact opposite a lot of the times. So that's my issue. Tucker Carlson seems like a nice dude. Again, nothing really against him, but he's not very well read on economics. And you can see that throughout this video, that he really doesn't understand his opponents. He doesn't really understand what he's talking about in regards to economics, especially considering he labeled establishment conservatives, or the mainstream right, Austrian. So, no, not even close. But to give you a few examples of why things aren't incredibly obvious. So seatbelt laws, the big debate between should we have mandatory seatbelt laws? Well, some people will say, yes, we should. The government should force you to wear your seatbelt because the amount of lives it saves is worth it. And the people on the opposite side will say, well, no, I don't like the government forcing me to do anything, so I'm against it just because the government is forcing me to do it. Well, there are a few states that have enacted that law, and therefore there's a few studies out there that really analyzes it and say, what's the result of mandatory seatbelt laws? And what we find is they don't actually save lives. They do the opposite. Again, something that you would obviously think, seatbelts save lives. Okay. Therefore, a government law mandating people to wear seatbelts is better off, or will save lives. And again, that turns out not to be the results. In fact, it's really bad for pedestrians and bike riders and people that ride motorcycles and those people that aren't wearing seatbelts, because what we find is that subconsciously, the people that are now forced to wear a seatbelt drive slightly more dangerously than they did before. They take a slight amount more risks. So we'll find that in car crashes and that, sure, they wore a seatbelt. Now, they lived where if they didn't wear a seatbelt, they would have died. But of all these times of driving slightly more dangerously, every time they hit a new, they end up hitting more bike riders and pedestrians and those people end up suffering a lot more. So it's things like that where you wouldn't think something is the case unless you really looked into it. You can never look at economics and say the answer is obvious, because it really isn't.
And of course it should. She says we need more workplace apprenticeship programs because four-year college degrees aren't right for everyone.
And I disagree with that in the sense that he's referring to, or in the sense that Elizabeth Warren is referring to, because again, they're talking about we need more workplace apprenticeship programs. Okay, if the private sector wants to do more workplace apprenticeship programs, then they can do it, and they should do it. Again, if you that's something where if there's a market for it, if there's a demand for it, the market will fulfill that, as long as the government isn't putting up any artificial barriers, which they are. So if anything, we should repeal any kind of interference in the economy that messes with market signals like that. But the idea of like, oh, we can fix things with a jobs program, or things would be better off if we implement some kind of workplace like jobs training program. Well, if the government does it, we've found that the government has done it many times before, and they're catastrophic failures. The most notable example is, oh, how many people actually benefited from this jobs training program that cost tons of money? 2. Not 2,000, not 200, 2. Like, that's it. Just 2 people benefited from this government program that cost a ton of money. And obviously, you have to remember that it's not like you're comparing a society without a jobs program to a society with a jobs program. Like, you have to remember that every taxpayer dollar spent on a jobs program is money that was taken from the private sector to fund this program. So whatever that money would have gone to otherwise, you're losing that. That could have gone to investment in other directions. That probably would have been invested in a smarter way. But if you look back at certain jobs programs, you might be able to look it up and say, oh, here's a source that says, here's a jobs program that actually worked. I'm not saying jobs programs never work. I'm just saying that if you're going to point out that one or two, like, hey, look, these jobs programs worked, you have to ignore the 97 others that have catastrophically failed. And the issue with that is, like, usually what they'll say is, okay, we'll look at this program and we'll look at the results of the program and say this job trainings program trained 200,000 workers, and sometimes they'll leave it at that, which you can't do because, again, they usually say like, oh, 200,000 people enrolled. That's a clear sign that things are good. Well, it doesn't matter how many people enrolled, and how it matters how many people actually graduated. So some other looks at it will say, okay, this number of people actually graduated from the jobs program, therefore it's good. Well, you can't just stop there either, because you have to look at the number of people that actually got a job in the field afterwards, that actually got a job. And you can't even stop there either. You have to look at the number of people that kept that job. Like, they didn't just get a job, but they kept it for more than a few years, and that was the career path they kept moving forward. So there's no point in training someone, having some kind of apprenticeship program, if they're going to work in a job for 2 months and then quit and then do something else. So in that sense, those people that go down that route, go through the program and then quit soon after, that's still not considered a success. And then on top of that, you also have to factor out the number of people that would have done this anyway. Especially if you're, like, what if the private sector had just done it itself? Where would these people have gone? Because you got to remember, if someone is enrolling in a jobs training program funded by the government, it's entirely possible that they would have also done the same thing without the government program, but they would have done another program. They would have enrolled somewhere else. So it's things like that where on the surface of it, you can say, hey, this program worked, but it's because you're not looking at the numbers right. And what we find is that when you actually do look at the numbers and factor in all these extra variables, we find that it's a massive failure. It's the same thing like the wage gap. Like, on the surface of it, you could say, oh my God, that's bad. But when you start factoring in all these other variables, it kind of disappears. In the same sense that, yeah, jobs training programs, when you factor in the variables, pretty much every possible benefit disappears until you're realizing we spent all this money for very little success. So what are we at here?
Well, that's true. She says that taxpayers ought to benefit from the research and development that they pay for. And yet, she writes, quote, we often see American companies take that research and use it to manufacture products overseas, like Apple did with the iPhone. The companies get rich, and American taxpayers have subsidized the creation of low-wage foreign jobs.
Okay, so the issue here is if the government is subsidizing jobs and those jobs end up going overseas, rather than complaining and trying to force companies to come back, because again, if you're going to try to force companies to stay in the U.S., it's just not going to work. Like, that's not a good policy. They're just going to find all these kind of loopholes. They're going to lobby for loopholes and that, and really just the amount of money that you're spending trying to keep them in the U.S. is just way worse than just like lightening up the regulations and making it easier for them to just start their own jobs here, or making it easier to create jobs here. So, like, ease the regulatory burden. You can ease back government, and the companies will come back here. There are loads of regulations out there that have absolutely no benefit whatsoever, and we know that because the way our system kind of works is people want a regulation, so people in Congress are like, we want a regulation to stop people from doing this. So they have some lawmakers write up a regulation. They pass the regulation. They're like, look at me. Look what I did while I was in office. I passed this regulation, which helped workers, and yet nobody actually fact checks to see if that regulation actually did any good or was worth the money or did anything at all. And you might have some offices that say some think tanks or some institutes will go through and they'll look and say, does this policy actually help? And then they'll write up a 100-page policy paper, and then they'll publish the policy paper, and no one will read it. And like that. So in other words, there is no like fact-checking if these regulations actually work. People just assume they do, which is not always the case. But yeah, so I would say, like, if the issue here is that, oh, we're subsidizing this technology with taxpayer dollars and they're going overseas, well, why are we subsidizing it in the first place? Repeal the subsidy, like get rid of the subsidies, give the dollars back to the taxpayers.
End quote. And so on. She sounds like Donald Trump at his best. So who is this Elizabeth Warren, you ask? Well, not the race-hustling, gun-grabbing abortion extremist you thought you knew. Well, unfortunately, Elizabeth Warren is still all of those things, too. And that's exactly the problem, not just with Elizabeth Warren, but with American politics. In Washington, almost nobody speaks for the majority of voters. You're either a libertarian zealot controlled by the banks, yammering.
So I have to disagree with that there. Obviously, I'm going to have an issue with that. Like, libertarians are controlled by the banks. And again, just imagining that. The Republican Party is libertarian on economics. Like that, no. Wasn't it George Bush that said, wasn't it George Bush that said, I've abandoned free market principles to save the free market system? That is not something that any libertarian would endorse. And again, find anyone, just go around and start polling the people in Congress. Like, would you consider yourself, like pro-capitalist in the sense that capitalism is not just the best system, but an actual superior system? Poll how many of the establishment people, the politicians that have power, and ask them, are you a libertarian on economics? And they might give you a kind of wishy-washy answer, like, yeah, well, yes, I'm pro people or what, but for the most part, no. No, there are very few people in power. So it's like it's kind of like blaming. It's just so weird. It's like blaming the Republican or blaming libertarians who have pretty much zero power in terms of economics. And like the Austrian school again is not a mainstream school. Like that's a rather it's not the most popular school out there. It's mostly the Keynesians and then maybe the Chicago school second. But yeah, you're not going to find many Austrians running this country. I don't think you're going to find any, to be perfectly honest, besides like 3 or 4 congressmen. But yeah, it's the idea that like libertarians are controlled by the banks. Like you think the banks are pro-libertarian? That's not the case at all. The banks are not for libertarian policies. Like who do you think Teddy Roosevelt, like the trust busting of Teddy Roosevelt, and then continuing on with the trust busting was Taft later. Like who do you think they were really standing up to fight against the banks? Well, yes, but they were also backed by the banks. Like trust busting, like breaking up the banks. That was an initiative that was proudly supported by big banks because it was one banking cartel against another. That's what it was. One banking cartel was like, hey, Teddy Roosevelt, you should do this trust busting thing and break up our competitors. And that's exactly what he did. So you have to remember that all of these programs that claim to be like anti-big business or like helping the people and against big business supports half of these, like raising the minimum wage. Just yesterday, the Walmart CEO was like, we need to raise the minimum wage. So do you think that's him being principled, or do you think that's him realizing that if we raise the minimum wage, I can afford that, but small business competitors cannot? I just want to point that out, that every single regulation that you pass on an industry that to supposedly fight these big corporations, the big corporations are like, okay, what's this going to cost me, $1 million? Okay, whatever. And what's it going to cost a small business? Like an extra few $100s to implement that? Well, it's much easier for the big corporations to overcome these regulations than it is for the little guys. So it's just ridiculous. Like this is not something that Tucker Carlson is completely misunderstanding. Like all of economics, basically. He's taking the same position that, again, he is literally taking Elizabeth Warren's position. And I'm not saying the position is bad specifically because Elizabeth Warren supports it, but I'm saying Elizabeth Warren is wrong and so is Tucker Carlson. They are both wrong on this issue. It's not like a difference of opinion. It's that, again, if you say the sky is green, it's not a difference of opinion to say you're wrong. It's just you're wrong.
On about entrepreneurship and how we need to cut entitlements.
So now he's complaining about cutting entitlements. And it's like, yeah, I'm for cutting entitlements. Like, are you not for cutting entitlements? Do you realize, like, the problems of the welfare state? Do you realize the problems of Social Security and Medicare, how they're eventually going to go flat broke? And you really think people are talking about, like, cutting entitlements in any significant sense? Like, they're not, because it's political suicide. Charles Murray, I'm actually halfway through this book, wrote a great book called Losing Ground, and that's where I'm getting some of this some of what I'm talking about from. But he goes through like American social policy, like Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, I think was one of them, from 1950 to 1980, and basically says all of these anti-poverty programs made poverty worse. Because what they did was they passed all these poverty programs, and then they looked at the trends and said, well, poverty went down after we passed these programs, therefore these programs helped. And that's not true at all. Because what you do is if you look at poverty, like capitalism as like just free market capitalism, under that system, poverty will go down. Capitalism will make poverty go down just on its own. The rates of poverty will go down. But what we find is that every time government's like, okay, well, we have to pass this program to fight poverty. We got to declare a war on poverty. So they pass a program, and then they look and they see that poverty is still going down. So they're like, hey, clearly it helped. Clearly it's us. Well, what you find is poverty was actually going down faster before the program than after. So you find that, if anything, the program actually contributed to poverty because it slowed the rate at which poverty was decreasing. So stuff like that. Like, you can't just say, like, I'm someone that supports pro-American or pro-voter or policies. I'm the person that supports policies for the common man. Like, we've seen this with Hillary and pretty much all the Democrats. That's what they say. Like, I support policies for the common man, for the little guy. I'm against the 1%. I support policies for the people, not the 1%. That doesn't mean anything to say you're for the worker. All that matters is what the actual policies do. And again, as we've seen, a lot of these supposedly pro-worker policies, how good have they actually done? Like, you understand nowadays, like, we're fighting racism nowadays. We're, like, all these organizations fighting racism. Are they actually fighting racism? No. It's the same kind of thing. Like, you can say you're pro-worker all you want, but if the policies don't actually reflect that, then I'm going to disagree with you. I'm going to say, you need to get as far away from workers as you can.
That's one side of the aisle. Or worse, you're some decadent trust fund socialist who wants to ban passenger cars and give Medicaid to illegal aliens. That's the other side. What there isn't is a caucus that represents where most Americans actually are. Nationalist on economics, fairly traditional on the social issues. Imagine a politician who wanted to make your health care cheaper but wasn't ghoulishly excited about partial birth abortion.
So I find this interesting that he's saying, like, just imagine this mythical politician that isn't for partial birth abortion, but also wants healthcare to be cheaper. Which, like, is he saying that the right doesn't want healthcare to be cheaper? Is he saying that, like, anyone at all on the right is like, yeah, I don't care if people starve in the street. Like, whatever. Like, I don't care if healthcare is cheaper. I don't care if it's super expensive. Like, I'm not for cheaper healthcare. It's like, no. Like, what? The problem is everyone wants cheaper healthcare. Every single person wants cheaper healthcare. So saying you want cheaper healthcare means absolutely nothing, because you'll find Bernie Sanders wants cheaper healthcare. He wants healthcare to be more affordable for the Americans, or for anyone really. He wants healthcare, everyone to have healthcare. He wants everyone to have good quality healthcare. But that doesn't matter. Who cares what he says? It's what his policies actually result in. And as we've seen, those on the right, like those, especially the libertarians and the Austrians, like the Austrian economists, they are advocating for policies that would make healthcare cheaper. They are advocating for look, I work in healthcare. I'm going to point out the problems. Like, I can bring up a few charts if you wanted. The amount of bureaucracy in healthcare right now, basically, it is nowhere even remotely close to a free market. Like, competition is good in a free market, right? I can't open a competing healthcare facility. Nobody, regardless of their qualifications, can't open up a new hospital or healthcare facility without getting permission from their competitors. So just imagine, for example, it's called like a certificate of need or something like that, to where you have to prove to your competitors that this hospital is necessary or this new healthcare facility is necessary. It's like, how's that competition at all? Imagine saying that if you want to, like, imagine just saying that if someone wanted to open up a bank, a local community bank, they had to get permission from JP Morgan Chase and all the big banks before they were allowed to open that up. How is that competition at all? But yes, our healthcare system is not is nowhere near good at all. It has numerous flaws. And to say that, like, the right or the libertarians don't want healthcare to be cheaper, like, that's just it's I honestly expected better from Tucker. It's kind of disappointing, because I think for the most part he has a good grasp on what's going on, and then you see him talk about economics and it's like, no, not at all.
Imagine someone who genuinely respected the nuclear family and sympathized with the culture of rural America, but at the same time was willing to take your side against rapacious credit card companies bleeding you dry at 35% interest.
And it's the same, like, basic rhetoric of us versus them. Like, if you're somehow pro-capitalist, you're supporting the big corporations and you're not supporting the little guy. And it's stuff that Ben Shapiro, I can't remember it, but Ben Shapiro, somehow at first, in some way, I think it was the Sunday special, was talking with Tucker Carlson, and it did go through why, they got into a thing over, I'm pretty sure it was credit card interest, but, basically Ben Shapiro, like, whatever you think of him, is you can tell he's pretty well informed when it comes to economics. Like, you can tell he knows his stuff. And you can tell Tucker does not know his stuff, because Ben Shapiro's arguments are very, like, you can tell he's referencing all these things, he's referencing studies, and he's like, yeah, this is what's happening, and Tucker's is very, like, but I think we should support the common man, or something. Like, it's just phrases that it doesn't mean anything in the grand scheme of things. It's like, the issue here, to tell you the difference between, like, my difference between Tucker Carlson and myself is, it's not that one person, say, from an engineering standpoint, like, one person wants to build a bridge and the other doesn't want to build a bridge. That's not the case. We both want to build a bridge. Tucker Carlson is saying, here's my idea for a bridge, and I'm looking at this and saying, this bridge is going to collapse. And Tucker's coming back and saying, well, you just don't care about building a bridge or something. It's like, no, I can say that you want to build this, sure, but it's going to collapse. It's not going to work. That's my issue with him. He's saying we should do this, and I'm saying, okay, it doesn't matter what you want to do. What are these policies actually going to result in? And we're finding out that, yeah, what he's advocating for is not going to be good. And the people he's attacking is supposedly not wanting healthcare to be cheaper. It's like, these are the people that want to make healthcare cheaper. But yeah, Ben Shapiro did go through, I think, I'll see if I can find it and put it in the comments if I can find the video, or put it in the description. Sorry. When exactly why Tucker was wrong on the credit card company things. Like, sure, it's bad, but like there are credit card companies that completely that, have this huge long terms of service thing, and like they don't get the people don't know what they're getting into, and then they're strapped with debt. Sure, that's bad, that's awful. But from what I've talked to people about, Tucker Carlson seems to be like against the idea of just charging. Like, the idea of charging interest at a high rate is immoral or something. And that's wrong. Like, that's based on faulty economics. The thinking behind that is based on faulty economics.
Would you vote for someone like that? My gosh, of course you would. Who wouldn't? That candidate.
So there we go, right there. Actually, like, why would you say, like, who wouldn't vote for someone like that? It's like, yeah, people would vote for stuff like that, and they have. Like, that's the entire Republican Party. It's stuff that, again, once you're saying, like, why wouldn't someone vote like that? Of course, like, the common man would support something like this. Okay, then why are these people in office? Well, the truth is they are in office, and things aren't getting any better.
It would be elected in a landslide every single time. And yet that candidate is the opposite of pretty much everyone currently serving in our Congress.
I disagree entirely. Again, like, he's all appealing with ideas that sound good but aren't good in practice. And this is like ideas that say, well, like, what if we implement a policy that does this? Well, if the policy doesn't work, again, I don't care. And this is like, he's describing mainstream Republicans. And I'm not going to say like all Republicans are principled people that truly believe in Tucker's policies or anything. Most of them, I'm pretty sure, are corrupt, just because most politicians are corrupt. But the ones that actually believe in a certain economic policy, and they want to really make change in Congress. I mean, how many people are agreeing with Tucker's caricature of this so-called, like, super libertarian Austrian economics congressman? Again, like 4. Rand Paul, Thomas Massie, Justin Amash, and maybe Mike Lee, and maybe, I've heard maybe Mark Meadows. But that's about it. Honestly, that's about it.
Our leadership class remains resolutely libertarian.
No, that's not true at all, honestly. Like, again, try to poll people. Imagine if you were to do a poll and say, how many of you consider yourself libertarian? Again, 4? Like, no. The idea, like, it annoys me. It's not at all true. Like, it kind of makes me worry that Tucker Carlson sees, like, the mainstream conservatives as libertarian. It's like, okay, if they are libertarians to him, how far on the left is he on economics? But no, on this thing, he's wrong. He's like, yeah, I support policies for the common man. Well, so does Bernie Sanders. So does Ocasio-Cortez. That's what they say. They support policies that support the common man against the big corporation. But that's all just words. That means nothing if your policies don't actually do that.
Committed to the rhetoric of markets when it serves them, utterly libertine on questions of culture.
And this kind of confuses me too. I'm not really sure who he's referring to. Honestly, like, it supports markets when it suits them. Well, it seems like Tucker is almost saying, well, they shouldn't support markets at all, or like they're not consistent. Well, in that sense, yeah. Does the mainstream right, like the Republicans, do a lot of them only support markets when it suits them? Yes. But it seems like Tucker and I have the opposite sense of, I think they should support markets all the time. Because that ends up just being the best. It ends up helping people. And then he says, like, oh, they're libertine in culture. Well, that has nothing to do with markets. Like, is that hypocritical? Like, who cares? We're talking about markets here. We're not talking about their overall political views. Like, if they're libertine in culture, okay, that doesn't nullify their views on economics. And again, I'm not libertine in culture. so I get that I might be a bit rare in that aspect. I don't represent everyone. But in the sense, the idea that, like, oh, if you're like, that you have to be to say you're a free market capitalist and incredibly pro-capitalist is to also be libertine on things, and I don't know, it's wrong.
Republicans will lecture you about how payday loan scams are a critical part of our market economy. Then they'll work to make it easier for your kids to smoke weed because, hey, freedom.
And obviously that's a pretty bad caricature of what they actually believe. But yeah, it's like, should we legalize weed? Sure. I mean, is that making it easier for the kids to get weed? Sure. But it's the idea of, like, that's not government's job. For one, even if it is government's job, look at the war on drugs. It's a complete failure. Like, people look at the opioid epidemic and they're like, oh, all the more reason to declare this war on drugs. It's like, we've been fighting it for, 30, 40 years, and it's a miserable failure. Well, in that part. So that is kind of a lesson in economics. The idea that if you ban something, it just won't go away. Now, and if something is truly, like, something like murder, like, I'm not saying, like, oh, well, there's no point in banning murder because you'll still have murder. Banning something doesn't. No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying something like murder is objectively immoral. It violates people's rights. Something like smoking weed does not violate people's rights. And the idea is, if you want to get people to stop smoking weed, then convince them. Like, isn't that the job of conservatives to support this conservative culture of like being virtuous in that and not doing drugs or heroin and coke and working hard, and that's like, I'm all for those things. Like, I support that. I support conservative culture in general. I would say I'm pretty conservative when it comes to culture, but I don't want the government enforcing that because, one, I don't feel comfortable with forcing my views on other people. I want to convince them, and two, it doesn't work when you have the government force conservative morality on economics. What you find is the economics says, okay, well, screw you. Like, it says it's not going to work. It's just not going to work. It's like enforcing conservative morality on physics or something. Like, physics is true. It is amoral. It's not moral or immoral. It just is. It is truth. And if you're going to say, like, well, I disagree with this with this view of physics because it's immoral, it's like, you can't do that. You have to understand economics and then go from there, and then say like you can on a private individual scale and in the private sector, you can manipulate markets as part of the market, and things will be fine. But when you start regulating it through government like that, enforcing certain policies, like what Tucker is advocating, you find that you're not getting what he thinks he's going to get. Things are going to get worse, not better, for what he claims to support.
Democrats will nod in total agreement. They're on the same page. Just last week, the Trump administration announced an innovative new way to protect American workers from the ever-cascading tidal wave of cheap third-world labor flooding this country. Until the Mexican government stops pushing illegal aliens north over our border, we will impose tariffs on all Mexican goods that we import. Now, that's the kind of thing you might propose to protect your country if you cared about your people. The Democrats, of course, opposed it. They don't even pretend to care about the American people anymore. Here's what Republicans said.
Look, I think it's safe to say you've talked to all of our members. We're not fans of tariffs. We're still hoping that this can be avoided.
We're not fans of tariffs. Imagine a more supercilious, more out of touch, more infuriating response. Well, you can't, because there isn't one. In other words, says Mitch McConnell, the idea may work in practice, but we're against it because it doesn't work in theory. That's the Republican Party 2019. No wonder they keep losing.
Now, Tucker's wrong on tariffs here. So the thing about tariffs is, to give you an idea, I've actually, there's someone I know that worded it perfectly. And I'm actually the guy that I'm referring to here runs the Facebook page Well Actually and posts some really great memes. So you should go follow that meme page. It's great. But he takes a really good approach. He's someone who's a Trump supporter. He's someone that is way more pro-Trump than I am. And he put this whole thing on tariffs perfectly. So he would say tariffs is, like, the issue with Trump in terms of tariffs is that Trump doesn't have much, like, he doesn't really have a clear opinion on what he thinks on tariffs. You can tell he's pro-tariffs, but he doesn't really elaborate any further. Sometimes he says things like tariffs are great economic policy, and that is something that is factually incorrect. Tariffs are terrible economic policy, and that if you want, like, it doesn't work. But sometimes tariffs are good, like, are good bargaining chips. They might work good as political policy. And in that sense, you can say, okay, they might be a necessary evil in that respect. But the interesting thing about tariffs is when it comes to the field of economics, like, there's a joke that, like, economics is the only field where two people can win the Nobel Prize in economics for completely opposite things. Because economics, like, there are so many different schools of economics and theories that they're very divided on just about everything. That if you go through, like, take everyone from each school of economics and ask them a question, you're never going to find one issue that they pretty much all agree on, except one, and that is tariffs. Pretty much everyone, like, from the left to the right to the center, like, every economist, pretty much, just about every single one, will say that as economic policy, tariffs are bad. Tariffs are nothing but an extra tax. It does not work for good economic policy. It makes things worse. And if you're taking out the political aspect of it, tariffs are bad economic policy. That's pretty much, like, there's so much backing that. There's so much research backing that it's like, yeah, it's bad policy. Now, again, what Trump has said in some aspects, the reason why his tariffs are so controversial is because he's used them in some senses as bargaining chips. So the tariffs on Mexico, like, if you were to just put down this tariff on Mexico and say, I'm doing this and I don't expect to get anything out of it, but the policy is, the tariff is good in and of itself, I would disagree. That is objectively wrong. Tariffs are bad policy. Or bad for the economy, I should say. Now, it seems Trump used this as a bargaining chip because once he did that, Mexico was like, okay, we're willing to negotiate, like, we're willing to come to the table here. And in that sense, you could say that was good political policy because it was a bargaining chip. Used against Mexico. And in that sense, the fact that they're willing to come to the table on that is okay. Then it did a good thing. So it's like trade wars with China. Now, if you want to put forth a tariff and say, okay, well, the whole reason I'm putting forth this tariff is to encourage countries to remove their tariffs against us, then okay, like, I can understand that argument. I can understand that your goal of putting forth a tariff is to get rid of other tariffs. Then sure, like, that's fine. But when you say that just like the American economy will be better off by placing forth a tariff just because the tariff itself is actually good, it is not a means to an end, it is the end, well, in that sense, it's incorrect. And I do think Tucker Carlson seems to believe that, I mean, I might be wrong, but he seems to be the one that says tariffs are bad, or tariffs are good as economic policy. And it's like, no, that's wrong. I'm sorry. Like they don't help the economy. They are good as political bargaining chips, as I said, and in that sense, sure, you can make a case for that, as Trump has done before, that, hey, tariffs are good if it is a bargaining chip as negotiation against other countries to maybe get them to remove their tariffs or to do something that you want. Okay, again, it's like if you strap a bomb and go into a building and say, like, okay, like, do what I want. Bombs are not good, but bombs are not good. But if you're gonna do it as a bargaining chip, then in a purely, like, Machiavellian sense, you could say, okay, they can lead to results that you want. It's something kind of like that. But yeah, and then he kind of ends up with, we'll go the last 4 seconds, I guess.
They deserve it.
Oh, that was it. Like, that Republicans will lose if they don't essentially agree with him. And I would say he's gotten this completely backwards. That my issue with Republicans in general is that they aren't pro-capitalist enough. That they tend to give in to the left too much on things like economics. That they stand back and say, okay, well, the left is actually right on this, or like capitalism, sure, it did screw up here, and government does need to bail it out and that, and yeah, like, I don't think that's a good thing, because you're giving, like something bad happens, the left says, clearly it was deregulation, or clearly it was the big banks that caused this depression, or clearly it was unregulated capitalism, and the right should be saying, no, that is objectively false, you're wrong. Screw you. But instead they're saying, oh, well, okay, well, capitalism is still good, right? But capitalism's not all bad, but yeah, I guess it did screw up here, so it's not perfect, but yeah, it's not all bad. There's some good sides to it, and there's a problem with that, because then you're kind of giving up your own ground. Because now the left can say, well, capitalism caused the Great Depression, and then it was the left's policies that bailed out and saved the Depression from being even worse. Then they can say, oh, it was the government that fought poverty with all of these anti-poverty programs. And then they can say, well, deregulation caused the financial crisis in 2008, and it was the left's pro-government policies that fixed this. And for the most part, I see some parts of the right saying, well, that's not entirely correct, and other parts of the right are like, yeah, I mean, I guess your capitalism's still good, but yeah, and this time it hasn't done it. But no, the response should be, no, what you are saying is incorrect. It wasn't capitalism that led to the Great Depression. It was the Fed manipulating interest rates and all sorts of other government interventions that caused the Great Depression. And then it was FDR's New Deal that made the Depression great. It was this involvement that made it even worse. And then we can look at, again, the anti-poverty programs that seems to have done a lot more harm than good in terms of fighting poverty. And we can see all of the major problems, like with like the big thing conservatives are talking about now is fatherlessness, and that the idea of single parent families and how awful that is. And we've destroyed the nuclear family. It's like, yeah, like a lot of what Tucker seems to support in terms of economic policies have done major damages to like conservative culture. Because remember that we always had a social safety net, and it was usually like the churches, or it was your community or your charity, and that, and it wasn't perfect, but it did pretty well. And then as soon as they put forth all of these like supposedly anti-poverty programs, well, people began taking advantage of that. People began exploiting that. Now you didn't need to be a nice person with friends, and you didn't need to participate in the community. You didn't need to be a good person. Now you could just collect welfare. So in that sense, it completely destroyed that. So I think the reason it would be in the best interest of conservatives to adopt a more pro-capitalist libertarian economic policy, because it seems that whenever they meet in the middle like that, Tucker's policies will harm conservative culture. Because again, I know conservatives care a lot about like the conservative culture, and so do I. I like the conservative culture a lot more than what the left is advocating at the moment. And their the left's economic policies have done a lot of damage to conservative culture. So it's like it's you're shooting yourself in the foot when you're doing what Tucker says. So I'm sorry this video was so long, but I wanted to cover it fully. Again, this went for a lot longer. But yeah, there's a lot to digest here. That's the problem. It takes 10 seconds to put forth something that's wrong, and it takes 10 minutes to really debunk that and refute it. But yeah, hopefully, again, if you disagree with me, let me know what you think in the comments. I'm trying to emphasize that it's not like, because I brought this up before when Tucker Carlson says stuff like this. And the responses I've gotten back were things like, oh, well, you're just a Puritan, or I'm not someone that like agrees with the right on everything. Sometimes you can agree with the left on stuff, or sometimes you can be, sometimes you have to compromise. I'm not saying like Tucker and I have a different opinion on the kind of world we want to see in the future. We pretty much agree, I think, on the kind of world we want to see in the future. The difference is his policies, I think, will do the exact opposite of what he wants. And my policies are what I advocate in response, the things he's attacking. Imagine if conservatives had really stuck to like had actually adopted like more libertarian economic policy. This world I really don't think we'd be facing like the SJW craziness stuff that we would now. I don't think we'd be facing like the rise of socialism. Again, as people are becoming more socialist as time goes on. I don't think any of this stuff. We would be facing any of this stuff. I think these policies have hurt conservatives in the long run to be not stridently pro-capitalist on these things. And it's hard to take that position, right? It's hard to take the pro-capitalist position because it seems cold-hearted. It seems awful. But what we find is that it's these policies that make people better off. It makes everyone better off, both the rich and the poor. And Tucker's perspective, I'm sorry on this, he's just wrong. But let me know what you think in the comment section. If you disagree, let me know why. If you agree, let me know why. Like the video if you enjoyed, subscribe for more. And again, if you genuinely disagree, I want to know why in the comments section. Maybe I'll do a follow-up video on it if I see some arguments brought up in the comments. I might comment on them further. We'll go back and forth. Because again, if it turns out that I am wrong, I want to be proven. I want to be shown that I am wrong, and I will thank the person that shows that I'm wrong. But in this sense, Yeah, no. If there's one thing I know, I don't know that much, but if there's one thing I know, it's economics. So, yeah, again, let me know what you think in the comments. Like the video if you enjoyed. Subscribe for more. And thanks for watching.